the first one is to inform and connect across an ideological spectrum. There's a lot of good work that is happening with economic democracy, and we hope to create spaces that will allow for connections to be made and to be able to grow awareness. The second one, it's that time of the semester where we're looking at starting looking at syllabi for January for the new semester. And so we're hoping to share some resources for you to create that syllabi. And third, we're hoping to grow the team. Economic democracy isn't just for economists or business schools, and it needs everyone. So I just wanted to quickly present some of our speakers. So our first speaker is Evan. So Evan is the Senior Director for Planning and Education at the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. Our next speaker is Rebecca Lurie, which is the founder of the Community and Worker Ownership Project at the City University of New York, the School for Labor and Urban Studies, and the Murphy Institute, where she also serves as a faculty in the Urban Studies Department. Adria Sharp, Project Director of the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. And our last speaker, Melissa Hoover, Co-Executive Director for Partnerships and Growth at the Democracy at Work Institute. So before we begin with our speakers, we wanted to give a quick sense of who is in the room today and who registered generally. So we created some word clouds about who is here. So we got a lot of different disciplines, economics, urban planning, economic development. Some of you are in health disparity research, labor relations, woodworking, community banking, marketing, cooperative management, Asian American history, civic engagement. And then the next word cloud is what some of you responded to in our survey for what aspects of economic democracy are we interested. So there's a lot about economic development, sustainability, health equity, labor organizing, local community, best practices or tools and exercises for teaching economic democracy, different strategies, different readings, the digital economy, workshop plans, and lots of different aspects there. So now we'll begin with our speakers. And if you have any questions at any time, feel free to place them in the chat box and we'll get to them at the very end. So first we have Evan, Senior Director for Planning and Education at the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. And we'll go ahead and get started there.
Great. So thanks everybody. I'm gonna just talk for a couple of minutes to kind of give a little bit more flesh onto the purpose and where we're coming from at BCDI, but also kind of an overarching sense of connection of education. So I think we all talk about education a lot in the larger sort of employee ownership field. It's been a part of people understanding and seeing it as critical need, critical infrastructure, underlying so many ways in which we see growth and transformation possible. Since it is an event about economic democracy and cooperatives, how could you have an event without mentioning, of course, the Godfather and Mondragon? From this particular angle, this quote I've found really grounding and inspiring, which addresses the way in which economic democracy and cooperativism has a dual purpose as an economic movement and an economic rationale that has an educative function, and that it is also an educative movement that utilizes economic action as part of its educational philosophy. And I've always just found that to be a really nice way of thinking about how we bring people into this, in addition to learning about the technical specs and the business models and entrepreneurial training, that there's an understanding about relationships of the economy and society. We can go to the next slide. So. So this has been reflected while we often talk about, noting Mondragon's infrastructure, particularly their university infrastructure, which is really the focus of our work today. Mondragon has a less discussed anyway in the United States, really well-developed whole child educational pedagogical approach that runs from kindergarten all the way through the university system. And so this Mondragon educational pathway, which at the earliest ages, they utilize a phrase known as the pedagogy of trust, or the confianza is the word. So pedagogy and confianza and trust, it can be translated a few different ways, but that there's an educational philosophy of cooperation and cultural coherence that underpins their educational philosophy before people in the community and the regional economy get to the university stage. And so there's a tremendous amount of what you might call, I don't know if child development psychologists would approve, software, right, that's built into the system before people are reaching the workforce and thinking about the relationship. And so this integration of a pathway and thinking upstream is a key political as well as economic rationale that serves to basically ensure the possibility of intergenerational turnover and longevity for the regional economy. You can go to the next slide. And so these are just some couple quotes from scholars, longtime scholars and mentors of mine personally, but I think notable scholars in the field who have spoken in the United States context at the connection of social movement and economic education and cooperative education, thinking about the relationship of what happens in the classroom, what happens in the university classroom, the high school classroom. Jessica Gordon-Emhart in particular has talked about this from an early set of ages. In her lesser known work has talked about various stages of child and family development and the role of cooperative education before you even get to sort of the ideological battles of teaching heterodox economics at the university level. Stacey Sutton also has really been recently making this argument in connection to her research around municipal ecosystems for cooperative development. You can go to the next slide. And so this is part of the work that we're doing here at BCDI. One of the reasons why over the summer I thought about approaching this group of folks for this webinar for the fall was to think about, a United States pathway, right? What would be our equivalent of this sort of long-term, decades worth of work that it took in Mondragon and Emilia-Romagna to build out an educational pathway, right? And thinking about upstream determinants of the social environment, the economic and the political environment at a local and national level. About how we see this feeding into education of entrepreneurs who have certain set of cultural assumptions as well as technical skills, and the need to think as educators about how people are entering classrooms and living in community and learning. And I think Rebecca will speak a little bit to that as well. You can go to the next slide, Giselle. Great. So yeah, that's all for me. That's sort of our thinking and approach and rationale that we've developed here at BCDI and working with partners, particularly in higher education, to think about how to do this. And so that's sort of, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our neighbor at CUNY in Manhattan, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Evan. Do you all control the slides? Is that?
We've got them.
Okay, so you can go to the first slide, but it doesn't matter. I'm very, very happy to be here and to support this work. Little disclosure, I was on the founding board of the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, so this gives me particular joy, and seeing some people in the room that I've known for years as well. Sort of that intergenerational approach of we are here. Thanks for starting with that Bob Marley song as well. And I do want to do a moment of a land acknowledgement. I was going to do a slide on it and I didn't, but let me just say that as we sit in the territory of Lenape, those who stewarded this land before us, most of us, and depending on where you are, it could be a different location. I'd like to pay particular attention to the fact that those who stewarded this place called Turtle Island had much different ideas about working together economically and cooperatively than our dominant society has, and we can learn from that. And in fact, the Haudenosaunee, which is sometimes referred to as the Six Nations, or the Iroquois that existed in the, and still do many, in the northwest of New York State, that they actually informed much of our Constitution and helped us understand cooperativism in a way that is baked in some of the roots of our democratic awareness, but is certainly buried deep. So we can go on now, as I wanted to speak about skills, knowledge, and competencies and values for teaching economic democracy. Next slide. And that's my place of work, and we can pause right there. Paulo Freire is really a strong influencer for me and perhaps many of us, and stating liberating education consists in acts of cognition, not transferals of information, speaks strongly to me, who began as an educator in vocational and occupational skills. I really believe that we learn all along the way. Next slide. And so there's no wrong door to learn and practice cooperation. This is very important for me because I know I see higher ed sometimes as a privileged state or a temporary state, but learning is lifelong. Let's pay attention to all the ways we can learn, teach, and be. So there's this expression, everything we need to know we learned in kindergarten. Next slide. You can see what that means, you know, bottom right, live a balanced life, learn some and think some, and off to the right where you see be kind. Next slide. There are different ways people learn, and I think this is a very important notion that I've taken on as an educator. One that actually, as a young person undiagnosed with dyslexia, I thought I could not learn much. I really was I felt like one of those stupid kids in a bunch of, and otherwise a gifted class. It was a big challenge for me because reading was so hard. And so when I started to understand there were all these different ways people learn, it became it became much easier and more welcome for me both to be a learner and to become an educator. And I really lean much higher towards the discuss, experience, and even teach someone else way of how we learn. So I want to really stress this because certainly in higher ed, it's a place where we think people need to read and write and be scholarly, but I think that that could be overrated when we think about the huge environment in which we need to educate. I'll give you an example on the next slide. Something I've done in my graduate program, we now have at the School of Labor and Urban Studies. It's about the practice and it's project-based learning. So when we innovated these classes, I received a number of calls from people who wanted to be in the class but couldn't for several reasons, but the most common was, well, maybe the two. They didn't have the money, but they also didn't have the credits. They weren't able to go to college and register in college, but they were in the middle of doing interesting things that were cooperative or building co-ops or in businesses that were converting. And so I got permission from the school administration to invite and allow project champions into the class. And so the project champions were there as experts and really would full learning partners to the students. They didn't have to do the papers that the registered students had to do. And the reading was all optional, but they actually informed the students a whole lot for the work that they were doing. And it became project-based experiences. We're now graduating our first graduate certificate holders, and they're holding a series of sessions called Dolphin Schools, again, where they take in community partners to help pitch the idea so that we don't just create something in what might be referred to as an ivory tower, but we really build things together. And that's my Dolphin School model right there, not your average Shark Tank. Next slide. So I really love this slide. And if I only had one slide for my presentation, I would say like this. We have buried treasure of cooperativism, which is, again, what we learned in kindergarten, and it's deeply rooted and it grows fractally. So we have to find ways that these skills can be both found and replicated everywhere. And this is an image of mycelium growing underground. I often say that the end of the day, the only laws that matter are nature's laws, so we should understand them. So understanding the life of mycelium underground, I think, is really important for us to sort of compare and mimic as a way to think like that. Next slide. So this is a model after doing a lot of research with the cooperative ecosystems in the country, and actually also from Mondragon and around the world, where I understand, and being based at a School for Labor and Urban Studies, needed to understand how it is that we build cooperatives. Why would we do that? And so I say, first, you need to have that political context. It's not just for the sake of making money, it's for the sake of understanding your place in the world as part of the working class. But also any entity needs to understand the political context of their industry. So that means regulation and legislation that might impact positively or negatively. And then there's the heart of the matter, that being the people, understanding how we manage in a way that really brings out the best in us. And with hierarchical thinking and oppression of all sorts that may fall under all the different headings of colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, racism, we have a lot to heal when people show up anywhere. So if we're aware of that and become somewhat trauma informed as we manage one another, we can build stronger teams rather than work from a lens of oppression and dominance. And the last two parts of this are, there are two hands to the operation. There is the hand that gets the job done, like the skills of the thing. If you're a carpenter, do you know how to use a hammer? If you're a baker, do you know how to bake the brownies? But also there's the finances of the thing. And those are really different people. Many, many times in co-ops, we have people who want to start a business because they know how to do the thing, but they lack the skills in these other three areas, the money, the heart, and the globe. So it's very important that we in education sort of bring that all together. Next slide. That's just another way to look at it, that there are four aspects that are required for any strong business, enterprise, industry, or sector to thrive in ways that uplift the working class. And I want to stress that, because otherwise there could be a lot of ways that this is used by anybody. Nothing wrong with that, except that we want to change a bigger dynamic in the world, which looks like empowering people to be the best they can in a relationship to each other and the world that's non-oppressive. Next slide. This is perhaps also one of those important slides I pop into many, many presentations, which comes from movement generation, and it's the just transition framework. And anyone can Google it if you're not familiar with it. And I think it's an important slide to understand that there's a lot of things we fight and a lot of things we need to build. And so the extractive economy are the things we are constantly fighting. When we look at our fight right now in the elections, for example, when we look for all the things that we build a movement against, really important, but also, and how do we build the things we need? And that's what we start to look at when we build a new cooperative economy. Next slide. So there's so many different ways. As I was saying, there's no wrong way to learn this. There's not a wrong place. As a matter of fact, people involved in any number of these areas can be involved in teaching and learning about cooperative economics. As long as we are trauma informed and justice informed, it helps us to think that we're part of building a new world. If we're teaching classes in sociology, if we're teaching about business management, how do we help people think about the broader way that they can play a role in the economy? So I say often it's, how do we be the change? And there are two guardrails I suggest always, is how do we practice and be democratic and transparent? And to me, that's really the meat on all of these bones, because being democratic in a hierarchical society can be really hard, as a magnetic pull often suggests that people manage a certain way. And how do we think about doing that differently? And transparency really helps us give information to everybody, but we can't be fully transparent if we don't have information that helps inform that. For example, you give somebody a stack of files in a Google Drive and say, this is all of our business files. But if people don't have time to go through all that, it's no longer transparent. So how do we help people understand the different levels of knowledge needed? Next slide. So I say there are different ways people show up for education, and we need to be aware of all of that. Of course, many people on this call are looking at higher ed, but even in our higher ed institutions, we do a lot of professional training, a lot of community education. We do a lot of non-credit education, business training. And so I want people to realize there's lots of different ways we can bring in these skills. There shouldn't be a wrong way if we want to be like the mycelium. Next slide. So again, where do people go and arrive to learn? And all of this is true. I don't want to just preference the university. I want to say, particularly being part of the public university, we can have play in every place. All the different ways we teach for community organizing, education, professional development. Go ahead, next slide. And finally, I want to just make sure people know that at the college, we developed a 4-course graduate level certificate in workplace democracy and community ownership, where we have 4 courses. And the first 3 mimic exactly what I talked about, the globe, the heart, and the hands, at least the hands with the finances. And the last class is really where we're designing the capstone now that uses what I referred to earlier as the dolphin schools. Let's take your ideas, let's pitch it to everybody who could be a stakeholder and see how well it flies. And the next slide is just, I would be handing out a flyer if we were all in person. So if you want more information on that, you can scan the QR code. But that's my awareness that as we shifted to online presenting, we have a different way to share information. So I'll end there and let the next person take up and as we talk about the different ways. Thanks, Evan, for saying we'll share this all out.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Next, we have Adria from Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations. And I believe, Adria, you wanted to share your screen, so I'll stop my share here.
Thank you. Thank you, Giselle. Thank you, Evan, for organizing this space. Thank you, Rebecca, for that really profound and beautiful presentation. I really appreciated it. I'm happy to be here. Wonderful to be with all of you. My name is Adria Scharf, and I am the, they've recently given me a new title. I am now the Director of Education and Collaborations for the Institute for the Study of Employee Ownership and Profit Sharing. We are housed at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers. And as part of my job, I do manage and I'm developing and evolving this resource, which is available for free to the public. It's called the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership, or CLEO for short. And it's a large online library of teaching materials and research materials about one important set of tools for economic democracy, worker ownership or employee ownership. And so I'm going to take you to the website so I can kind of give you a little tour and show you some of the highlights. Let me just go ahead and do that now. So this is the Curriculum Library for Employee Ownership. The URL is just cleo.rutgers.edu. And again, this is a sort of big tent clearinghouse online hub for information about employee ownership, broadly defined. And it's really a big tent space ideologically. So you will find materials in this library on the most revolutionary vanguard democratic worker cooperatives, organizations in which workers own and truly democratically govern their places of work. You will also find information about a variety of other forms of broad-based equity sharing or employee stock ownership plans, which are the most common form of employee ownership in the United States. Employee stock ownership plans are sort of like employee ownership as a retirement plan. So it's a big tent space where you will find information, case studies, research articles, videos on, a wide assortment of different types of employee ownership. And let me say, I've been tasked at Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations with focusing primarily on the college and university setting. So part of my strategic goal for this website is to equip more faculty members in any discipline with the resources they need in order to teach about employee ownership in their own classes. That said, this resource is free for anyone to use, and I know practitioners and business owners and workers, advocates also do use this site, and just want to sort of nod to and lift up the point that both Evan and Rebecca made about sort of like the full life cycle and the importance of education in all different sorts of spaces and all different sorts of ages. So again, it was designed primarily with kind of scholars and teaching faculty in mind, but it's a free, accessible space to anyone. I wanted to point out a few helpful resources here, but I think first what I want to do is just give you a quick tour of the site, which is to say that if you're about teaching or looking for a resource, either to integrate into your syllabus for a college class or for a workshop, etc., You can search for information a couple of different ways here. One is just to type into this like big search bar on the main page. But the more efficient and more effective way to search within the Clio website is to click on advanced search, that red button, because here you can, on the left, kind of click on a number of different search categories and really home in on exactly what you want. So for example, if you really want a case study of an employee-owned company, and you what specifically just care about worker cooperatives, so case study worker cooperatives, etc. You can kind of home in precisely on what you need. And you can also select your discipline, if you're an economist or a sociologist or whatever. The format category is very helpful if you're looking for video or case studies or a journal article or a presentation, like some examples of slides that other faculty members have used in their own classes. You can click there. You can also zoom in on specific industries, companies, and regions of the world. So again, not too complicated, but the advanced search gives you more control. A few features on this site I wanted to flag. One is up here on the upper right of the homepage. If you click on guest speakers, in talking to faculty members, I've been struck by how, well, it is wonderful when faculty members are able to develop an entire course focused on economic democracy or focused on workplace democracy. In talking to faculty members, I've been struck by how most faculty members, even faculty members with expertise on these questions, even faculty members with a deep stake in these questions, most faculty members at most universities do not have the luxury of designing an entire course focused on these topics. But what I've also found is that any faculty member from any discipline is able to integrate teaching about worker ownership or workplace democracy almost into literally any class. And to make that as easy as possible, to make it as easy as possible for teaching faculty to integrate teaching about worker ownership into any class, I created this Employee Ownership Speakers Bureau, and the individuals on the list change year to year. This is the current list. But I just wanted to share for any of you that these speakers are available to speak for free to any college or university classroom. It's really easy to use this. If you're designing your syllabus and you're interested in planting some seeds of discussion and thinking around workplace democracy or worker ownership, but you haven't designed your whole syllabus around it, and you just need kind of an easy off-the-shelf way, this is a really good free resource to, again, have a fabulous guest speaker come in and present. And they can kind of frame their experiences and what they present based on the course that you are teaching. And I can help you pick a good match that will be a good fit for your class. So if you click on the person's name, you can see a little bio and some of the speaking topics that they're interested in speaking about. And then to request a speaker, you can just complete this form and I get an email. And again, you can indicate if you have like somebody in mind you really want, or if you're open, your preferred date or time, and then be sure to tell me what you want them to talk about. And or the name of your class, and we can find a good fit for you. So I am now taking requests for guest speakers for spring 2023 classes. So anybody on this call who's interested, please, I invite you to make use of this. Going back to the main page and just scrolling down, also on the Clio website, we wanted to create some really easily accessible kind of collections that you can access just at a click. And so just wanted to flag here that we have this collection of free full text case studies. There are more than 130 different case studies of worker-owned companies in the whole Clio online library, but some of them go to like a publisher site and you need access through an academic library in order to access them, or you have to pay the publishing house $5 in order to access the case study. But here, these are totally free full text case studies that you can access just at the click of a button. There are a bunch of videos here, new policy reports, and this is a growing collection of syllabi that I'm wanting to add to, and I invite your contributions to it. We're wanting to create just kind of a little storehouse of syllabi on topics related to workplace democracy and worker ownership that are free and that anyone's able to borrow from. And then just, I guess, the last two things, if you just kind of want the bird's eye view of everything in this whole Clio database, you can click here on browse by category, and that gives you kind of the big picture of everything that's in here and the ways that we have coded each resource. And then at the very bottom, we have a very occasional e-newsletter. We only send email updates out maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So if anybody's interested in staying in touch and hearing more updates about the curriculum library for employee ownership, please sign up there. A couple of, why don't you just flag, not take too much more time, but just flag a couple of recent additions to the curriculum library for employee ownership that might be helpful. One is, together with some colleagues, at least one of whom I see is on this call with us, Victor Chen, Catherine Chen, and Katie Sobering and I pulled together a PowerPoint deck of sort of templates of lots of different slides that we want to just make freely available for anybody to adapt, change, use, be inspired by for their own course presentations. So again, if you go to, it's called Slides, Teaching Alternatives to Bureaucracy. And these were a set of slides that we developed for the American Sociological Association conference this summer. And what I wanted to show you was that if you scroll down, we developed some individual slides with ideas for a whole variety of different classes, like really out of the box classes. If you teach methods classes, you can connect questions of workplace democracy and cooperative participatory organization to within that frame. Theory courses, orgs and business classes, work and inequality, race, ethnicity, gender, immigration, etc. So again, those are a free set of resources. And then I'll add that this Clio database is constantly evolving. We are adding some very significant new additions to it in early 2023, which will include a new video course that will have a whole bunch of short 3 to 7 minute video segments introducing worker ownership that anyone can use in their courses. We are also launching a new case study series where we'll have a whole bunch of brand new, fully downloadable case studies of worker-owned and democratic organizations that will be available for free download. And we are about to put out a digital ebook on worker cooperatives in the health sector, which will be available from the Clio homepage. So those are just a few resources. And again, this is a living data set. I'm constantly adding new material. So would love to invite your contributions if you have a wonderful syllabus or a lesson plan or a classroom activity, a role play activity, a video that I might add to the database. I welcome your contributions. So with that, please, thank you very much, and please stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Adria. Those are amazing resources. Just wanted to remind everyone that we will be sharing all of these resources out at the end of the webinar. And we will also have a Q&A for a few moments at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or hold on to them. And without further ado, I'll pass it on to Melissa Hoover from the Democracy at Work Institute. And I will share my screen. 1 second.
Okay, hi, good morning or good afternoon. So I'm Melissa Hoover from the Democracy at Work Institute. I'm going to be presenting about set of modules, of curriculum modules that we developed in partnership with Rutgers University that are intended to serve as a sort of an introduction to worker ownership from the perspective of some practitioners like business support service providers like attorneys and accountants, and a lot from worker owners themselves. So I want to give a shout out to the funder for this project, which was Jean Wardford from the Kellogg Foundation, who had a real vision that there's a deeply missing racial equity dimension in the educational resources available around worker ownership. And so she funded an early research in the field to uncover what are some of the impacts of employee ownership broadly, ESOPs and worker co-ops and trusts for workers of color and low-wage workers. And so that sort of foundational research started a conversation that we see this curriculum module as continuing, which is to say, let's look explicitly at the ways that worker ownership is serving communities who are locked out of good jobs and business ownership opportunities, primarily communities of color, low-wage workers, and service sector industries. So the next slide. So we're at this moment that Kellogg Foundation was sort of identifying and intervening in, but the moment is, predates funder interest and is really about the building of a movement. So we've seen these shifts in the field since the 90s, roughly. There was this sort of explosion of worker co-ops in particular in the 70s, and the ESOP legislation passed soon thereafter. And so both of the kind of major employee ownership forms are really within a 40-year period have come online in a new way. Worker co-ops, of course, exist throughout US history, and there's been amazing scholarship uncovering a lot of that. But for our current moment, there was really relatively little activity before the 70s, in the decades before the 70s. Then this growth in the 70s of mostly countercultural co-ops, mostly, not exclusively, but mostly started by people who were looking for an alternative. And then in the 80s, there was some activity around manufacturing and buyouts. And by the 90s, we see a field really beginning to hone a focus on providing a way into the economy for people who were locked out of it, which I think really shifts the way the form should be understood and supported. And so that was in the 90s, but we're 20 years on from that, 20 plus years on, and there's been a real growth, a generation of worker owners and of co-op developers who have come up in the space and have brought a lot of capacity to the organizations that have also grown with them, particularly in the last 10 years. There's also been a real growth of nonprofit organizations, some of them dedicated to worker ownership and worker co-op development, but a lot of them with a broader purview, right, to do worker center organizing, to meet community needs. And we're finding those nonprofits are interested in worker ownership as a tool to realize their other, the other parts of their mission. And so we saw sort of all of these people, some of them are resources for sharing information, some of them need information, but the landscape is really fertile right now. There's a huge demand for understanding just kind of the basics of worker co-ops. Next slide, please. So we wanted to go into this project owning and reframing terms that are often either rejected within shared ownership spaces or used as weapons against people who are trying to organize economically. So concepts of ownership, entrepreneurship, and capital, we wanted to bring forward and say, these are relevant for us. We are developing businesses that operate in the market, and we are reaping the rewards and benefits of ownership, but we may think about it a little bit differently, right? So whereas in a conventional entrepreneurship framework, ownership may mean the right to sell, or it may mean ownership of a share and the imperative to maximize the value of that share. For us, ownership means stewardship and access to the resources, that the group is stewarding. Similarly, with entrepreneurship, we're not thinking about sort of the Silicon Valley, exit model where you go public and, that's the vaunted entrepreneur, the solo man, usually, who's like, doing a startup. But we do think entrepreneurship and the principles and drivers of entrepreneurship are relevant in the worker co-op space, and we want to hold that up and elevate that kind of hustle and grit that really it takes to start a business. And then same thing with capital access. We're not looking at the conventional sources of investment in small business ownership, but we are acknowledging that businesses that are starting need capital access. They need to be able to accept investment, borrow money, and manage that effectively so that they can return it to the people who fronted it, who in some cases are themselves. So really becoming fluent in capital was one of our goals. Our audiences for this, as I said, are sort of many entrepreneurs of necessity. So we're looking at people who are building co-ops to create jobs for themselves because they can't get them in other ways because there are structural barriers in the system. We're also seeing a ton of individual entrepreneurs who nonetheless want to use some sort of cooperative form. So it may not be strictly a worker co-op where everyone owns the business together, but it may be a secondary co-op where individual solopreneurs or micro entrepreneurs are using a secondary co-op form that the businesses join. So a co-op of businesses as opposed to a co-op of individuals, but the same groups of people we think are animated by those needs. And so we sort of put them together. We're also targeting business owners who are concerned with their legacy and thinking about selling to their employees. This meant to sort of orient them to the basics of the form. And then finally, service providers. So that may be co-op developers, but it may also be attorneys and accountants who are coming into the space because there is a deep need for attorneys and accountants to support the growth of worker co-ops. Our presenters, accordingly, were a pretty diverse bunch. Racial equity was our North Star. So I think 95% of our presenters are people of color, experts in their field. And that was important to us, that we have not just representation, but leadership and voice in shaping the curriculum from people who are from communities of color and working in communities of color. That said, we have a broad range of kind of vocations. So we had academics, worker owners, some service providers and co-op developers. Across all of those presenters, we tried to take a storytelling approach. So we pushed our academics to move away from data and frameworks and into stories. We pushed our worker owners to tell their stories, warts and all, and to share their emotions, sort of trying to reframe this curriculum as a very human-centered way of presenting basic information. So these are our modules. We focused on, like I said, on the basics. So what is a worker co-op? We wanted to talk about growth, again, to that point of entrepreneurship and capital access, but thinking a little bit differently about how the cooperative form is an advantage in growth. And then we had kind of the standards, democratic management, governance, legal, and employee, and capital. We did have a dedicated module for worker co-ops in African-American cooperative economics because there's such rich scholarship, interest, and demand for that content. So we talked a little bit about origin stories of both historical co-ops and current day cooperatives. We had 7 modules. What we learned in the process of doing this is that I will say that the modules are charmingly low key. This was COVID. People were recording in their bedrooms, in their home offices, around their kids. It was, a challenge, I think, to kind of get the kind of video quality that probably Rutgers usually maintains. They have a filming studio and techs on site, and they edit. We weren't able to access that for most of our presenters. I think only one of our presenters came into the studio, and then we did the rest of it remotely on webcams. And so there was I think we learned how hard it is basically to make video content, to do the scripts, the visuals, the filming, the editing. It's very labor intensive. So we would have probably done fewer in retrospect and made them deeper. Maybe not necessarily longer, but sort of used our modules to go deeper into a topic. We would have talked a little bit more about the actual how-tos of like, what is capital? How do you get it? How do you use it? How do you steward it? Our capital access, I think, is of just a very kind of conventional, here's how to access loans, sort of the how-tos of that. But what we've heard over and over again is that, for historical reasons of racist restrictions on access to capital, people need more avenues than traditional lenders. So we would have emphasized that more, and I think we will in future content. And then we're also seeing more demand from people who do consider themselves traditional entrepreneurs, people who may have access to capital, to resources, who want to start businesses, but they want to do it in a different and more values-driven way. So our assumptions that sort of this content would be targeted to people for whom the co-op was one of their few options, we needed to check that, because actually people who do have other options for starting businesses are still choosing cooperative forms, and we want to be able to meet their needs as well and bring their skills and resources and background into dialogue with the skills, resources, and backgrounds that we did highlight in the series. So I think these are just extensions for future video series. I don't know if I have a final slide. I do have a final thought, which is that with this curriculum, we tried to do something, it's partly driven by practicality and partly driven by the principles of our approach, which is to bring together academics, formal credentialed academics, along with sort of practitioners, lawyers, and accountants who've been trained in this field, and then people who live the experience every day of being worker owners, and put them in the same place, on the same playing field, and honor their wisdom together and have their wisdom talk to each other. And I don't know, I'm not sure totally how successful we were with that, but I think it was worth trying, and it's worth, I think, continuing to try to do to de-silo academic practitioners and elevate on the ground co-op practitioners to come into the same space to have a rich and sophisticated conversation together.
Thank you so much, Melissa. We will be sharing out the information on the employee ownership online education program. And now we have a few moments for some Q&A. And I saw we have one question in the chat from Jerome. You both spoke of the need for narratives and address it in the heart. In your experience, I'd be curious to hear what field you're teaching and working within. What role can educators and researchers play in delivering narratives and curriculum suitable to that need?
So I saw that was maybe addressed to Melissa and myself. I'll speak for what I think. I mentioned there's no wrong way. It even could be actually, let's look at our curriculum let's look at our syllabus for the semester. What do people agree with? Let's look at whether we're going to end early. What do we think? A lot of putting that conversation into a classroom lets us start to practice that muscle that says we decide. And it's little things that can add up to bigger things. So in the class that I really love to teach, called Cooperative Management for a Changing World, I really lay out, like, at any point, even when you're managing a team of people in a traditional hierarchical way, you have objectives and deliverables. Do people agree with that? Is that what they think is the best idea? So really thinking about, well, and then I was able to turn that into a teaching module that sort of said, do you agree with the objectives of this course? So I think there are a lot of ways that we could circle back and integrate that philosophy of we decide, but deeply, people who have been historically marginalized often don't speak up. So inviting that space for people to step up or step back in that philosophy that says, if you speak a lot, step back. And if you're going to be quiet, step up. And how do we make people ready for that with different ways to participate, I think is really important. So some of it is really good teaching practices, but it also ends up being good management practices and even decent parenting practices if you want to apply it to a different place in life.
From my perspective, I agree with Rebecca, and I think to the question of specifically kind of what role can educators and researchers play in helping to deliver those narratives, I guess I would say first, let's think about data and how studies are done and how data is gathered and then shared. We at the Democracy at Work Institute try to take a data together, participant-informed data, participant-led and directed data approach. So when we study the state of the sector or the state of worker co-op development, we start by designing the research with the people that are going to be the subject of the study. And then similarly, part of that design is feeding back that data in accessible ways. So I think as researchers who are dealing with data, sort of always working through the field organizations and the worker co-ops, directly to help inform the questions that are useful to them to ask, and then giving them that data as a powerful tool for how they can understand themselves, but also their businesses. A couple other things, I don't know exactly who else on the call, but I do think there's a really critical need for kind of human-centered business and management practice. And that's a much bigger field than just cooperatives. We can look at positive psychology, leadership development, participatory culture building. I mean, all of the things that are sort of buzzwords in business competitive advantage right now, co-ops have been doing forever, but they've been doing it without a lot of the kind of dialogue with management, academics who study management and teach management. And so I think building both learning from current practices in co-ops and also helping co-ops strengthen their practices and put them in a framework that is bigger than what they are, I think is useful. And then finally, I think on the narrative piece, conventional businesses access marketing and communication supports in all kinds of ways. And we know that worker co-ops tend to underinvest in marketing and in telling their own story in the same way. And so I think there's an opportunity to really think about marketing the co-op advantage and training cooperators in doing that, and sort of studying and delivering narratives about how cooperatives actually are more competitive in the market. I understand that takes us into a place people may be uncomfortable with, but I think from a practical perspective, that's one of the needs.
Well, in dialogue with you, Melissa, I'd say it's not just about being more competitive in the market. I think it's also about being ready for some drastic change in our children's lifetime. And how do we, plant those seeds constantly so that as people move through the multiple crises we are and will be facing, they have different muscle memory. And if it's in starting a co-op, even if it fails, if it's in forming a basketball team, all of these things that are really could use cooperativism, how do we help that happen? I see Hector Soto on this call, who's from the Bronx, and I'm reminded that there's a book I'm telling everyone about, Everything for Everyone, New York City Commune, Oral Histories, 2052 to 2072. Long title, but suffice it to say, it's a futuristic story. And it starts how Hunts Point Market's taken over during the revolution of the 40s. And if we allow ourselves to think 50 years forward, what do we need to be doing now? And business planning does suggest often you want to look at that long-term plan, but I think we need to consider the multiple crises of democracy, climate change, racism, go on, list it all. How do we give people skills for that? So I'm all in embedding it in what you think is a business, but it's life. What do other people think or wonder?
Well, maybe if I can just comment, I asked the question to you both, and I suggested I'm an economist myself, and I've been interested in cooperatives for many years, even before I got into economics. And you know, as I think Melissa, you just mentioned, you know, these are institutions that have been working on these ideas for, you know, centuries, literally, and they literally get ignored, at least in the economics curriculum. Maybe there's a difference in management. There may be one like info box on page 340 of some book, but really they are sidelined, and so I'm thinking constantly about how to integrate within the economics profession. I'm sure there are similar conversations going on in others, cooperatives, cooperative principles, and so on, more into the curriculum and have them be more present. So we are interested to be in touch with people or to hear your opinions on those things or similar issues. Thank you.
Jerome, are you familiar with donut economics? And that
Yes,
model?
Kate Rayworth. Yes.
Because I think that really helps us think differently about what is economic. Even the word growth is such an enigma to me, but economic life can really help as we shift the study of economics to say, you know, how do we care for each other on this planet?
For me, her book had the most fascinating or compelling message was this idea that metaphors and images are at the root of so much of our social science. And the question is, are we using the right images? And this idea of, you know, a cycle that is complete, and, you know, the economy is being sort of a self-contained cycle, of course, in today's world with climate change is absolutely absurd. You know, with 1/3 of Pakistan underwater, how can you talk about some kind of complete circle and so on? So.
Exactly. Which is why I chose mycelium to remind us, like, we all know this stuff. There's something that is inherent. There's also something I wanted to say when I spoke. My brother, who studied psychology to be a psychotherapist, taught me this. And when I had a challenge in a classroom, he said, make them right. And it really just opened up this universe to me about how we approach teaching. No one is ever wrong. They may not be answering the question you asked in the way you wanted it answered, but when we make people right, we uplift their spirit and we start to see a broader way of seeing the world. I mean, that might be hard when we look at the dynamics of our politics today, but the notion in a classroom that there are lots of ways to think about it, let's hear what you have to say, I think is important to uplift people rather than put them down.
Hector, you came off mute. I don't know if that was if you were looking to ask a question. Sorry, I don't mean to put you on the spot if you weren't.
That's okay. I have a lot of thoughts, and I teach at a community college in the Bronx, and I'm a lawyer by training. I teach courses, law-related courses, a lot of them around public safety and criminal law. And not directly connected, but start my classes with asking questions of my students about what would happen if there were no police and no laws, and to get them to start thinking about their role, who they are, and what would happen. A whole lot of series of questions, but what would happen in white neighborhoods if there were no police? Well, people from black neighborhoods would go into the white neighborhoods. That's actually what they tell me. My point is, I think it's almost going back to what Rebecca presented at the beginning, that it's like relearning what you learned in kindergarten, and that you do have a connection, a responsibility, a touch of everybody, to everybody else, that nothing happens independently of anybody. But we're taught that very quickly, or the idea of we is pulled out of us very quickly. And so we're taught I. Capitalism, I think, emphasizes the I in so many ways. And part of the just, I mean, I'm just random thoughts. Part of what happened, the students come in, they have they're in a school, and now more so than ever, that's concerned about their social mobility. And social mobility means getting a job that pays a certain amount of money after they graduate. And now they're also, how do we just keep them in the school, because the retention rates have traditionally been horrible. And I find, maybe again, if the students start understanding, or giving them the option of understanding that they already have some, I don't teach critical thinking. I tell my students, you're already doing critical thinking. The implication of critical thinking, teaching critical thinking, is that you're not doing it. Somehow it's a negative on the student. And getting them to exercise what they have experienced in their lives makes sense, is real, and is valid. And that they may have the answers to things that nobody else, no scholar, no research, no grand mind has been able to decipher because of their life experience. I mean, I think I'm basically just saying that I think I don't know this area. I'm thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me, and I'm glad I'm here. But it's like, it's almost like there's a really basic, getting back to just getting students to think and to not see themselves as sitting in a classroom where they're literally in a silo in their desk. They don't know the person next to them. They don't know the person behind them, other than that if the person causes a problem, and that they are to be consumers in the classroom of information because they don't know anything. And getting them out of that mindset, or at least opening the door to them thinking about this, I think opens the door to a lot of other things, including everything that has been presented here. So I appreciate, and how to incorporate this into my syllabi in some way, and that connects to the idea of public safety being a we thing, not a police thing, not a law enforcement thing. It's the same issue.
That's right.
Anyway, and I thank you all for the presentation and the opportunity.
Thanks, Hector. Yeah, if there are any other questions, we can log them. Melissa, I know you just said you have to go off, and that's totally fine. So if there are other questions, we're happy to stay on for another 5 or so minutes for anyone else, or just log them and pass them along to Melissa. If anyone wants to do a quick hand raise for the last question, we'll take it. And if not, going once. Oh yeah, sorry, Drew. Yeah, Drew.
Here might be another issue that's related that would be closer to Hector's field of expertise. So there's a recent book out by Katharina Pistor, The Code of Capital, and she connects basically in the UK the rise of legislation protecting property, later protecting trust, protecting different aspects of property with the rise of the basically capitalist system. To what extent, Hector, do you think that the legal arena, and I know I'm not in the US myself, I'm in Germany, the US has been a sort of a litmus test recently for this legal arena, the jurisprudential arena, as a place of conflict with abortion rights and so on. To what extent do you see potentials for law and jurisprudence as a place to maybe facilitate more economic democracy in practice, or even in terms of discussion or discourse?
Well, it almost comes back to what I think has already been said. We have as long as this hierarchical system exists, even within the legal system, it is getting people the role of the lawyer in whatever forum or context the lawyer finds himself, the role of the lawyer as seeing himself or herself as the pinnacle and the entire source of all knowledge, and that everyone else is to become, again, a passive consumer of what the lawyer believes and what the lawyer thinks, and what, based on his or her understanding of precedent. And that doesn't mean that what the lawyer strategizes or is proposing is necessarily a negative or not something that's going to be productive, but it has, I think, to get to the more that it has the input of the people that are most going to be affected, that are the issue, that are suffering the issue, if you will, the more the legal system will become better at what it does. But the legal system is a forum of elites. Whether they're leftist elites or rightist elites, they're elites. And they act in that way, even if they may be thinking otherwise. And it's hard to get out of that mindset and out of that system. I mean, again, just my students, they expect me to be able to give them the correct legal answer, and I'm trying to get them out of the correct legal answer. What is that? Why do they even think that? But again, the law, education, academia plays a role. The law is going to continue to play a role, and attorneys are going to continue to play a role.
Yeah. This was a really great opening. I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to bring a lot of different disciplines and geographies too. Actually, there were over 60 people signed up for this from around the world. So I really was exciting, which, to get about a third of people is the average I've seen for Zoom webinars over the last couple of years, to have some, some balance of like people who sign up. So it's going to go out, the recording will go out, and for folks who, indicated their interests around broader frameworks and principles around solidarity economies and economic democracy, most of what we talked about today was in the realm of work, shared ownership, employee ownership, worker cooperatives. We're going to send out a set of resources that supplement what we shared out today, just because, this was a webinar, not like a whole day conference where we could share all of the things. A bunch of other resources that get into other ways in which people are building institutions of cooperation, shared ownership, shared governance, so that we, draw the boundaries, wider than just the realm of the workplace. But that was sort of the focus for today around economic democracy. But we'll share out, and I saw some comments around some folks talking about different resources in the chat. So yeah, that's what we'll do. We'll share out the recording, and eventually, I'm pretty sure, I think I'll check with our comms person here at BCDI. We'll either share it up on YouTube, or we'll just share out the recording directly. So with that.